between true Christians when their relationships become so fractured that they're tempted to lose hope for reconciliation? How does Paul's message to Philemon offer hope, or what are the limits of that hope for people in still living in a fallen world?
One of the things I think that's helpful to observe is the way Paul walked through difficult relationships. And one in particular that sort of abuts Philemon is the relationship, the strained relationship between Paul and Barnabas, going all the way back to the first missionary journey, where Barnabas, who was uncle to John Mark, wanted to take John Mark along on the second missionary journey when John Mark had abandoned the mission in the first missionary journey. And Paul was not willing to take John Mark along on the second missionary journey. And the book of Acts is clear. There was no small disturbance over how to handle that. And these two brothers, they walked away from each other. And what happened was they didn't force a closure at that point that could only have been painful. They let each other go, and my sense would be they entrusted one another to the Lord and said, we can't work this out now, and yet we're not going to let the mission just come to a halt, and we're not going to call each other out and force everybody to try to throw one of us out. What happened was Barnabas took John Mark back to Cyprus, where they'd gone in the first place in the first missionary journey, and Paul picked up Silas and launched the second missionary journey to the north through Asia Minor. And what happened was, because these brothers, they didn't force the church to come to a conclusion of who's right and who's wrong. They wound up with a ministry that proliferated, so that you had basically two missionary journeys going on at the same time. It abuts Philemon because in Colossians 4, we find Paul making affectionate remarks about John Mark, who was the source of the division among them in the first place. Colossians 4, if you give me a second to turn to it. Colossians 4:10. And it's interesting because in the previous verse he mentions, he links this letter up with Onesimus. I'll go back to verse 8. I've sent Tychicus to you for this very purpose, that you may know how we are, and that he may encourage your hearts, and with him Onesimus. So the scenario here is the estranged slave carrying the letter from Paul back to his master, along with this delegation that's bringing the letter to the Colossians. That is the letter to the Colossians, to the church in Colossae. And with him, Onesimus, the faithful and beloved brother, who is one of yourselves. They will tell you of everything that's taken place here. Aristarchus, now I'm on to verse 10. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning whom you have received instructions. If he comes to you, receive him. And there is a sense in which the sense that we get here is that there has been somewhere along the way, without there being an explanation of it, some sort of reconciliation. And that now, years later, Paul sees John Mark as being a part of the fellowship, a part of the koinonia, a part of the mission. And what is honorable and noble here is that Paul and Barnabas just gave the Lord time to work things out.
Well, Reggie, you mentioned that sometimes relationships just take time, and that part of managing that is just to trust that God can work in time. It is interesting that you point out that John Mark is mentioned there with Onesimus, verse by verse, and I bet that also pointed out a lot to Philemon and the church, that Paul was not asking them to do something he wasn't himself modeling.
That's a good point.